Good evening. I am Stephen Edholm from SkillCult.com. Who's confused about training trees and the different forms that you train trees into and how to prune trees and train trees in the first place and all that? Pretty much everybody. I've read a lot on this subject. It's been, something that's of interest to me, and it just took a really long time for me to start to sort it out and have everything sort of gel, because while there's a lot of information out there, it's usually the same information rehashed, and it's often very shallow, so it doesn't really go into enough depth for you to understand the problem. I'm going to spell it out in a way that I hope will lead to you having clearer goals when you're training your trees in the first place. Now, this is part of a series basically in a new project to, basically I have my sights set on reforming and improving common recommendations for training fruit trees, basically, because I've used the traditional common recommendations and I've been quite disappointed. They haven't served me well, and now I have other things that I do that I think work much better, and so we're going to work on that problem. But today I just want you to understand the tree forms that I'm going to be talking about a lot through that whole process. Now, there's a lot of different ways to train trees. Mostly I'm looking at large full-size trees, which are less and less common. In commercial production is going more toward these intensive systems of small trees in tightly spaced rows. They're grown on trellises and they're treated like pawns in a scheme. They're cogs in the machine, and they're actually not even supposed to live for very long. They use them for so long, and when production starts to taper off, they all get ripped out and replanted with something new. Now, those systems have advantages, but they also have disadvantages, and I think a lot of people for home orchardists still like and want an actual tree like this and or bigger. But when you're training up the tree in the first place, you want to train it to avoid some really common problems and have a convenient, long-lived, healthy tree. Okay, so we're going to start off with 3 common problems that lead to premature death and failure of trees. A lot of my information and inspiration came from a study that was done around 1925 or so, where these guys went and looked at apple trees in orchards. They talked to orchardists, they looked at the old literature going way back, and they identified some common problems in orchards, and they looked at the ways in which people had trained the trees in the first place that led to these problems, okay? So here's 3 major problems. One is narrow crotches. So if you have a trunk going here, and then you have a branch come off, but it comes off at a high angle like this, with a narrow angle in here. As this tree grows in diameter and gets larger, right, this is like it growing here, basically bark gets trapped right here. And this forms a weak union, and these often will split off. The same study, they actually studied with weights how these became weak, and they found that it didn't really matter what angle it came off at, as long as bark wasn't trapped in here. So that's the first one. Another one is having a lot of branches come off in the same area of the trunk. So let's say that we're training a young tree and we just cut it off like this, or well, up here, and we let all these branches just grow right below the cut and grow up like this. Well, it's widely known that this forms a weak union, and that these are more likely to split off and break right here. Another problem they found in this study was that, especially when people were training to a central leader, which is just a tall thing with a lot of branches like this, later in the life of the tree they were ending up having to cut off large branches, and that would leave large wounds, which allows fungus and rot to enter the core of the tree, and then eventually the tree starts to fail. The 3 common problems: narrow crotch angles, branches coming out of the trunk too close together, like too close to each other, and having to make large cuts, which lets rot into the tree. Okay, let's look at a real common traditional form. You have a sapling growing here like this, and let's say it looks like that. You cut it off like this, and then a bunch of branches sprout right here, right below the cut, because cutting it like that stimulates branch growth. This is gone. We cut that off, and now we can grow this into what's called an open center tree. So let's say this grows up, and it's going to look something like this. It's going to have 3 to 5 major branches, and these branches are all going to point in different directions. It's hard to draw that, but let's say we have four branches and they go in the 4 directions, north, south, east, west. This is called the open center or vase form, and in the ideal version it looks like an upside down funnel, or right side up funnel, I guess, and it allows a lot of light into the center of the tree, which is good for ripening fruit. It is pretty easy to maintain because it doesn't grow, straight up, so it's fairly low, kind of like this tree. And you can get in between the branches and work and all that stuff. So all that stuff is great. The problem is that because all these come from the same area, this tends to be weak. I mean, they're not all exactly the same, but imagine if they're like 3 to 6 inches apart. By the time they get large, they basically have all grown together, and then this becomes weak, and these commonly break. So the alternative to that is called the delayed open center. This is the open center. So the delayed open center simply takes these branches and it spaces them out along a trunk. So we're going to come up like this, and then we're going to have a branch go this way, say south, then one come up here a little bit further, and another branch goes this way. We come up a little bit further, and a branch goes this way. 3 to 5, I think, 3 or 4 is a good number. And then it comes up here, and let's say we have one more branch going off in another direction, and then we can just cut this central leader out. And now we have basically the same thing. We have light coming into the top, but we have these spaced out along the trunk, which is much stronger. Very simple. Delayed open center. So this delayed open center is actually pretty commonly recommended by universities and agricultural extension and organizations like that. But the way that people commonly recommend to train fruit trees, where you just have a stick and you cut it off and you hope that some branches grow back where you want them, it's kind of pretty rare that you get an idealized form of this. And the methods that I'm promoting now, and I've already done a video on this, you can go back and watch, it's pretty easy, at least with most of my experience, to get exactly what you want. And at the very worst, some stuff might not go exactly as you want, but it's hard to do much worse than the common recommendations that are now in place of just chopping this off and kind of hoping it grows back. So really this method is more suited to this form because it does work. You cut it off and a bunch of branches grow back, and you can probably end up with a few branches in different directions. But when you start trying to space them out like this doesn't work so good. And that's one of the reasons that while this is recommended fairly commonly, you rarely actually see it. Okay, another common, really traditional form is called the central leader, and that just basically, there's a lot of gray area between different training methods and stuff, but you could think of a central leader as if there's a main stem that's definitely thicker, and the top is dominant, and it keeps going up, and then there's a lot more of smaller, more horizontal branches down here. That would be kind of a typical central leader tree. Now the advantage is that it forms sort of this Christmas tree shape, and a lot of wild trees will grow this way. If you let them in nature, they'll tend to grow. If they're in the open, if they're in the woods competing, then they don't have the lower branches because the lower branches get shaded out and die. But in the open, many trees, not all, but many trees will grow this shape. This is good because when light can come down here and shine on all sides of the tree, and that's really good it's an efficient way for the tree to collect light. So the disadvantages for an orchardist is that it can get really tall, especially if it's a full-size tree. It can get very tall, and then you're going to have a tall ladder to get up in here. So it's not that great to manage. It's not as beautiful as a more spreading umbrella type of tree that we think of as an orchard tree. That's more like what I want my trees to be like. And again, in this 1925 study, they found that when people used this system, they almost always were coming back and making large cuts to thin these branches out because there was a lot of them later on. Now, there's another form called the modified central leader, and that's what this tree right here is. And we're going to look at that as pretty much the same as the form we just looked at here, the delayed open center. In fact, these terms are often used interchangeably. I've used them interchangeably, but I don't think it's a good idea because they really are and should be different. So we're going to have the same basic structure, but we're going to have basically like a little centerpiece in here. So we're going to come up maybe 18 to 20 inches above the last branch and then have this little centerpiece. And you may be able to see that right here in the middle. Now, this keeps the tree from just going up and up and up. And now there's a phenomenon called apical dominance. It just means that the top of a large branch or tree is dominant, and it has like a dominant hormone profile. It tends to grow more and it keep growing up, and it sends down messages this way to suppress the rest of this growth. But in this system, what's going to happen is that these are all actually going to grow pretty tall. So if you look at this branch here, they're both as tall as the center of the tree. And so what that does is it establishes co-dominance. Now, co-dominance just means that all of these guys are sharing resources now. Because think of this as you only have so much stuff coming up the tree. You're going to divert some here, some here, some here, some here, and some here. In a central leader tree, you're going to have a lot going this way, and this is going to be spread out between a lot more small branches. If we just say like we had a bunch of stuff here growing off, like extra stuff besides these main branches, well, that's going to divert growth energy and resources from these branches. So we're basically going to not have a lot of other stuff growing here, and then we have a situation, as long as these go up and they're relatively tall, they don't have to be exactly the same height or taller than this or anything, but that's the general idea. Then this is going to spread these resources out. You can see that this top here is actually a little bit smaller than the average branch of these three branches here. So what that does is it kind of suppresses this top growth and keeps it from going out of control, and then you end up with this nice umbrella effect and you have a low tree. Now, why would we even leave this when we could just cut it out like the central leader tree and let more light in here? Well, the reason I like it is because this actually provides a little shade in here. Now, typically you want light inside the inside of the tree because it makes higher quality fruit. You know, the fruit needs light to ripen, and that's what most training in orchards is all about, is getting light and air inside the tree. But we get extremely hot, intense sun here in the summer, and it will sunburn these branches. The light coming in and beating down on the tops of these branches, just like your nose gets sunburned, right? Because of this angle, and the sun's it's like a solar panel. So this kind of just through the day as the sun moves, it kind of, the shade kind of spreads across the inside of the tree here a little bit, and takes care of that problem. The other thing is some trees just really want to grow upward. My take on it at this point is that this is a little bit of a compromise. Like, this is particularly true of a lot of pear varieties. They just tend to be real upright growing, and they want to kind of grow as a central leader type of a tree. But if you can establish this sort of balance where you've balanced all these resources going into the different points out, and then you do this, I mean, if you abandon the tree, this is probably eventually going to attain dominance and go into more of a central leader type of form. But as long as you just prune it every year, it's going to grow up this much, and then you cut it off, right? And then the next year it's going to go like this, and it's going to grow up again, and you're going to cut it off, and it just kind of stays there. So once we get this structure in place, we can basically keep this basic shape. I mean, the limbs are going to get bigger, and it'll grow out, slowly grow out a little bit more and get larger in general. But we can kind of just establish this the way it is now and just sort of keep it there by yearly pruning. So the vase form and the delayed open center that I talked about, the open center or vase and delayed open center are more commonly used for peaches, nectarines, apricots, and stone fruits like that. And the modified central leader like this is more often used for apples and pears, but you can interchange a little bit. But now I want to talk about something else, because so far all we have is these main structures. Now this is called a scaffold. So remember that word, scaffold. Scaffold just means that this is a structure, like it's a major structure of the tree. This is a primary scaffold. But now I want to look at the tree from the top, because all we have so far is this main large structural wood, and we don't have any of the rest of it. Okay, so looking from the top, let's say that we have a trunk here, and we have established, let's do 3 main branches. We'll do a modified central leader like this. This is 3 branches, so we'll just kind of draw this tree. And those come out like that, looking from the top. Now in the middle, of course, we also have this little sort of centerpiece thing right here. So this just gives us our main structural wood. These are big, strong primary scaffolds to, you know, give us a place to start to grow fruit. But we're not just going to have, you know, fruits along the branch like this so much, right? So we need more structure than that. We need secondary scaffolds and other stuff. Now from here I want you to think about two different types of growth in the tree. One is structural growth and the other is fruiting wood. So structural wood and fruiting wood. All of this is structural wood. Eventually there's not going to be any fruit close in like this, right, into the tree. When you first grow them, yeah, it's going to grow fruit right along these stems and stuff like that. But eventually that's not going to be the case as we train the tree out more. So what we're going to end up is we have these big spaces in here and we want to fill out the canopy of the tree. So then we're going to have stuff come out like this, right? And maybe that stuff forks a little bit. It's just going to fill all this space up out here. Okay, so we have that, and then on that we have smaller wood. And this, eventually, as the tree matures, this is where our fruit's going to grow, out here. So as we go along through the next few years, if I'm able to keep making the videos I want to make, we're going to kind of deal with, you know, getting this structure first, and then getting this secondary structure, and getting all that in place relatively quickly, and then we have our basic structure, and we're just going to keep it. Now, since we only have these main branches that are large, we're never going to have to make any huge cuts unless we have, you know, a catastrophe. Like if a bear comes in here and just rips one of these branches off, I can't really do much about that. I'm just going to have to make a big cut. But in general, if everything goes well, we've set ourselves up to never have to make large cuts. And that includes these secondary scaffolds, right? Like this one comes out from the trunk, and then there's this secondary scaffold here, and there's other smaller secondary scaffolds, and then this big major one going out that way. And same on this one here. But we're never going to need to go back in here and just cut this off when it reaches, you know, 1.5 inches, 2 inches or more in diameter, because this is the main structure of the tree. As long as these things don't grow too close together, like eventually you're going to maybe thin some of those out, like these two right here might be a little close together, but it won't be too long before I cut that out, and it's not even going to be 1 inch in diameter at that point. So that's one of the advantages to these two systems, is that we know what we want, and we're going to come up, I'm just going to redraw this. You know, we know exactly what we want. And of course, these branches all point in different directions. Again, I can't really draw that, but so these point north, south, east, and west. And we go for that, and that's what we get. And there's not a lot of other stuff. There's nothing else big growing off the trunk. And we just establish this really nice permanent structural form, and then we just use that form to grow smaller fruiting wood. The small fruiting wood is going to, you know, keep reproducing itself. Sometimes you're going to end up cutting pieces off and growing new stuff, but this basic structure for the most part is going to remain intact. So that explains those two types of tree and why we use them, and I'm going to move this now and just take a look at this one right here, because this is a pretty ideal example of a modified central leader tree. These, by the way, are weights to kind of pull branches down to get them to go a little bit more horizontal, because the wood that I want to be like the fruiting scaffolds, you don't want it to grow straight up. It tends to go straight up. I just want to pull it down a little. This is actually pretty good right here. So you can see here that we have 1, 2, 3 main branches. You can see this one, I hope, on the back here, and then we have the centerpiece. You'll also notice that the trunk is large, and then it's slightly smaller, and then it's slightly smaller, and then of course the top there is quite a bit smaller. But as far as these branches go, they're all very similar in size, and they're sharing resources actually quite nicely. And all of these come out at a decent angle, so there's no bark that's ever going to get trapped in this crotch. And I did that on purpose while the tree was young, during June or something, when the shoot's first coming out. You know, it's grown out a ways, but it's still real rubbery and soft. I'll bend that down if I need to, whatever I need to do to get that angle. Now notice that they come out, but then they keep going up. This is kind of, you know, averages at about a 45-degree angle in this case. And that makes this basically like a trunk. So you can think of these three branches almost like trunks, even though they're coming off of a main, center trunk. But conceptually, in terms of the way that they use resources and the way that the tree sees them, in terms of its distribution of the resources, it's kind of like these are more like trunks. By the time the resources get up here to this centerpiece, they're mostly gone and everything's kind of shared out and balanced. Now this tree is a little bit odd because of a few reasons. For one thing, there's some seedlings grafted on here, here, and there, which I've just kind of let grow wild. So that's a little bit weird. And also, this was a different variety, and I cut everything off and regrafted it to a new variety because I didn't like the old variety. So it's actually still kind of recovering and regrowing the secondary scaffolds, because I took all of the secondary scaffolds off unless they were real major, like this one right here. I left that and I grafted on there, I grafted on there. With this one coming up, I grafted onto this, I grafted on there, I grafted on here, I grafted on there. Approximately what I look for in scaffolds that I know are going to grow out to be long-lived secondary scaffolds like this one is approximately 24 inches apart on one side, like this. This is what I want in the long run, and then kind of staggered on the other side the same way. Because if you think about it, 2 feet might seem like quite a ways, but when those two branches grow out and then they start to grow stuff like this and this, see, we start to get crossing in here. And eventually when all this fills out, that'll be a good spacing. Now you can leave some extra wood along here, and this originally had a lot more of little fruiting spurs and stuff along here, but because I was changing varieties, I took all of that stuff off. And because of that, it's going to take a little bit longer to come into full production. But overall, this is a pretty idealized form. You don't always get this form, but if you know what you want and you go for it from the start with methods that actually work and are basically designed to achieve something like this, then it's very possible to get good forms. One of the important things is that when these branches are young, you want to establish this codominance early. And also you don't want to leave a lot of extra growth on the trunk. I think I mentioned that already. Because if I leave a lot of other small branches out here, they're going to take away from the growth of these main scaffolds. So early in the growth of the tree, if you want this type of a structure, you need to take a lot of that stuff off and really guide the growth into these main branches right here. Okay, so other videos in this series are going to be like some lectures on just total geek out sessions on this study that I was talking about, and experiments that I've already outlined in my head and written down that I would like to do or like to see other people do. We're going to look at some of my older trees like this and look at the ways in which the things I've done have shaped the tree over the years for better or worse. And we can kind of look back at the tree, in its current structure as a history of the tree and the history of its training or its lack of training or neglect, how all those things influence the tree as it grows. And hopefully we'll get to that video this year, but everything's leafing out, so if I don't get it shot soon, we're going to have to wait till next year. But I hope that this video gave you a good idea of what these structures are like, why you might want to use them versus other structures. And again, just remember that there's a lot of other structures, and there's a lot of, especially with small trees and dwarf trees, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. Some of it's real creative and neat. They'll have it down to almost a science with these high production systems with like, what's it called, the tall spindle. There's something that's like shaped like a V on a V-shaped trellis. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. So I'm not at all against small, intensive, training and growth of trees like that. It's really good for people with small backyards. I have trees on trellises here. I have, dwarf trees and stuff like that. Many of us still want a large, spreading, beautiful, long-lived, healthy, actual tree. There's like a romantic attachment to that, and I think I speak for a lot of people when I say we don't want to see that era disappear completely just in favor of the most intensive, high production, short-lived also systems, because this tree may very well be here for a very, very long time. and it might end up being kind of a legacy tree. You know, this could be here, for all I know, 80 years from now, still producing fruit. Probably not, but hopefully. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.